I'd like to welcome all of you, friends, colleagues, and special guests to this afternoon lecture, which is co-sponsored by the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, which I have the pleasure of directing at present, and the Joukowsky Institute for the Archaeology of the Ancient World, which Andrew Scherer has the pleasure of directing at the current moment. My name is Neil Saphir. I'm also a professor in the history department, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Chris Heaney, who is here from the Penn State University, as well as a very special guest that we have who is visiting Brown at present, Gabriela Wiener, who will also be hearing from a little bit later in Chris's presentation, because as you will see, there's a very direct connection between the very different kinds of work that both Chris and Gabriela do. But I want to really focus my energy on introducing Chris, who is the model of a generous and generative colleague, known in the historical profession for tackling challenging topics of great relevance to Latin American historians and turning them into deft, readable, but also highly sensitive accounts that showcase the complexity of present-day debates and the relevance of very long historical arcs, from the pre-Columbian world to the very present. He has taken oft misunderstood indigenous practices and turned them into rich tapestries that our eyes and ears appreciate through his careful prose and his arresting images. In his most recent work, about which we will hear today, he has delved into the so-called skull wars and revealed Andean mummification practices in a way that shows the logic, artistry, and science of its earliest practitioners, while at the same time tracing a historical narrative of the ways that these artifacts, which are, after all, ancestral remains, have ended up as exemplars of the most fiercely racist practices on the part of the precursors of today's discipline of anthropology. In short, Chris Heaney wades into these controversies equipped with the best tools a historian can tie to their belt: insight, care, deep research, and a gifted, eloquent pen. Some of the work for Empires of the Dead, which I will hold in my hand in a little bit later on in the presentation, because I forgot to bring it up with me, was previewed in the history profession's flagship journal, the American Historical Review, an article of which students in my course on curators, hoarders, and looters, many of whom are here today, read just this week. Other more technical aspects of his work were previewed in ISIS, the Journal of the History of Science Society, another flagship journal for a very different audience. And it was a pleasure to welcome him to this class on collecting alongside Gabriela Wiener today for a conversation about the very fraught and complex nature of exhibition practices in today's museums and their origins long ago. In these scholarly journals were the venues in which I first had the pleasure of reading Chris's work at the intersection of indigenous history, Spanish imperial conquest, U.S. anthropology as a discipline, and present-day debates over museum studies and display. With the application of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, otherwise known as NAGPRA, from 1990, and even more recent federal laws demanding Native consent to show culturally significant artifacts and objects, Chris's latest work could not be more timely. Chris has won a number of awards in his career, beginning in 2003 as a senior at Yale University, where he won an essay prize for Best Senior Essay on the topic of Hiram Bingham and the lost treasures of Machu Picchu, which would become very soon, well, I guess maybe not so soon, 7 years later, a popular account entitled Cradle of Gold, The Story of Hiram Bingham, a Real-Life Indiana Jones and the Search for Machu Picchu, published in 2010. 7 years later, he won the Barnes F. Lathrop Prize for the best dissertation from the History Department of the University of Texas at Austin, from where he left and took on his current position at Penn State University. It is, as soon as I saw that this book came out, I was very keen on having Chris come and share the wealth of his knowledge across a variety of different fields with us. It's a pleasure, Chris, to welcome you to Brown. Thank you for coming, and please join me in welcoming you.
Thank you so much, Neil, for the overly generous introduction. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure being here. And I want to thank CLACS, the Watson Institute, and the Joukowsky Institute for sponsoring this visit, and for Maria Isabel and Elisa for coordinating it all. It's been an absolutely fascinating time, especially to be here at the same time as the writer Gabriela Wiener, who gave a fabulous talk yesterday, and we had a great discussion in Neil's class this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be in conversation, given that the novel Wako Retrato, or Undiscovered in English, came out when I was finishing Empires of the Dead, and it inspired some of its final stretches. Truly, by her book, it's better than anything I will say today, and at the end of my talk, we are hoping that she'll read part of it that intersects directly with what I'm talking about. So, what does it mean to mummify a museum? A few years ago, I had the pleasure of reviewing Steve Lubar's book, Inside the Lost Museum, which reflects on the life and afterlife of the Jenks Museum of Natural History and Anthropology, founded at Brown in 1871 and closed and dispersed in 1915. As Lubar explains, he, Mark Dion, and their students at Brown and RISD formed the Jenks Society for Lost Museums, which reimagined Jenks' creation as an art installation in its old quarters on Brown's campus. Not quite bringing it back to life so much as thinking with how the closure dispersed the museum's objects around Providence, including a university dump. Lubar asks why museums end. A finished museum is a dead museum, the curator George Brown Good said in 1889, and a dead museum is a useless museum. And yet, Lubar's book evokes sympathy for the dead museum that supposedly has lost its use, noting the trust society places in museums as institutions of knowledge and pleasure. What if outmoded exhibits were mummified, so we, with the largest scare quotes imaginable, might know or experience museums of the past? The problem is that one culture's museum can be another's house of horror. Native North Americans have, for over half a century, been asking U.S. institutions to take responsibility for the role of anthropology, science, and medicine in the looting of the ancestral dead. The passage of NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, was an important step towards addressing that past. But as communities realized, its terms adjudicated Native knowledges and claims of descent. This let some museums frame their reception of the dead as a controversial event rather than a lasting process, in part begun by genocide, territorial dispossession, grave robbing, and supremacist ideology. Scrutiny grew during the 2020 George Floyd protests, however, of museums and other institutions involved in racial violence over time, expanding the public's conception of whose ancestors museums had harmed. There have been calls for AGPRA, an African American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, as well as efforts such as those by Brown PhD Lyra Montero's finding ceremony to address the Black Philadelphian kin at UPenn, to take the authority to adjudicate and repatriate out of institutional hands altogether. It so accelerated the work that more Indigenous remains were repatriated last year than in any year prior in NAGPRA's existence, Penn State included. I'm coming here from the Pennsylvania State University, whose campuses are located on the original homelands of the Erie, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, Monongahela, Shawnee, Susquehannock, and Wazaze nations. Making that land acknowledgement, I think, means more now that Penn State is working to repatriate the ancestral remains of 26 Native North Americans that have been at our Matson Museum for years. things are changing fast. I know this is something that all of us are aware of in this room. Revisions of NAGPRA this January now require museums to obtain consent before displaying remains of ancestors or cultural belongings. Whole wings of museums are now themselves under glass, behind closed doors. There is, however, a hitch to this. NAGPRA has no mandate for Indigenous ancestors or kin from outside of the United States. Although some institutions have committed themselves to addressing those populations in those museums, they're starting with the people on whose land the institutions were built and whose hands made the bricks, as they should. But this might also be to gain time while museums check back in with the changes in other countries and communities whose remains they've had all these years. There is no little trepidation about what might happen in returns to other states that have no NAGPRA equivalent. In other words, this is an international situation of museums possessing the remains of Indigenous peoples. As the Colombian artist Gala Porras Kim explored in her 2021 work, I need to read it all out because it's fantastic. Leaving the institution through cremation is easier than a result of a deaccession policy, which was made in the wake of the 2018 fire that burned Brazil's National Museum, incinerating at least one Andean mummy. So if museums aren't yet reckoning with the Andean skeletons in their closets, who will? In her wonderful Waco Retrato, Gabriela writes about visiting the Museum of Man, or the Museum Quai Branly in Paris, and her narrator finds an empty display case that usually contains an infant mummy from Peru. If the absent child were there, she imagines someone, which would be me, giving in to the impulse to take the momie d'enfant in my arms, the looted baby, wrapped in a textile with two-headed snake designs and ocean waves bitten by time, then start running toward the quay, leaving the museum behind, heading toward the Eiffel Tower with no fixed plan other than to get as far away as possible from there, firing shots in the air. Again, read the book. It's much better than anything I have to tell you. Perhaps it's time for the museum to be robbed so that kinship can live. Today I'll be talking about how the history of Peru magnifies our understanding of this past, as well as its violence, as well as its care, by challenging our idea of how it all started. My new book, Empires of the Dead, is a history of how science and colonialism turned Inca and Andean ancestors and kin into specimens displayed in museums around the world. Its primary sources include published chronicles and natural histories, and the letters and writings of anthropologists. It also includes the archives generated by the display of the dead in Peruvian and American museums, like the art on the book's cover. This is a sculpture by the Cuban-German artist Nancy Torres. This book argues that this process of looting, disinterment, and visualization was a feature of the assault on indigenous sovereignty in Peru and the Americas. Peru shaped American anthropology too. The single largest group of people collected by American anthropologists prior to 1920 were from the Andes, whose core methodology of study in large groups, I believe, normalized the collection of whole series of other people's ancestors as well. But I also want us to think today about how ancestors and their knowledges have changed museums, making them into potential agents of change. Latin American history teaches us how indigenous actors have been integral to the knowledges of the so-called Western world, shaping medicine, botany, comparative ethnology, universal histories, even what Antonio Barrera Osorio calls the early scientific revolution. One way they did so was by mummifying museums, I want to propose. My book shows how Andean and Peruvian individuals unearthed and circulated former ancestors, sometimes to claim modern belonging, using museums to claim them as kin, connecting the world with an Andean ancestry that is especially invisible if we focus solely on a North Atlantic context. Which brings us to the matter of seeing. Today I'm going to be showing some images of older displays of ancestral and human remains from the Andes. I'm not an anthropologist, and so I can't say that I do so to rehumanize them through biographical study. I instead do so to show how pervasive they were in anthropology's museums and training until very recently, when their removal from display, even to perform respect, delayed some reckoning with the field and its violence. Also its care in particular cases. I also do so to explain a fact complicating that violence, that Peruvians, some of Andean heritage and descent, have worked hard for over 4 centuries to force outsiders to see those ancestors that colonialism assaulted and that science calls mummies or crania. The earliest known depictions of Inca and Andean ancestors were made by an indigenous Andean chronicler named Felipe Guamanpoma de Ayala, who in 1616 sent Spain's king his richly illustrated first new chronicle in good government. Guamanpoma, a Christian, depicted Inca ancestors to explain how they led Andean peoples to idolatry. Embalming the Inca's aya, or corpse, idolized him as an Iapa, a lightning god. But Guamanpoma also argued that Andean people were not all the same. As we remind students, they weren't all Inca. And though we often call the ancestral dead malquis, a plant to transplant, the Spaniards only recorded this beautiful vegetative metaphor for the dead in the mid-17th century in one particular place, Cajatambo. Andean peoples likely had more names for ancestors and dead than there were languages, of which there were many. Aya, Iapa, Malquis, Munaos were just the beginning. Guamanpoma depicted the death ways of Tawantinsuyu's other peoples, including his own, to induct the Spanish king into the nuances of Andean sovereignty, death, and care. Now, Guamanpoma is far from a display in the Chicago World's Fair, but their juxtaposition helps us grasp how a mummified museum might be acolonial, to borrow from anthropologist Mary Weismantel, how things in museums can extend challenging presences and confrontation and demand engagement with a beloved, even fearsome thing that can stare back. The work of Cuculi Velarde has likewise been inspirational. Her work suggests we are also here, standing on Pachamama, the earth. That this is also the Pachamama that is known and loved in the Andes. And its clay can be used to make ancestors of people who never presumed to be Peruvian. So my book has 3 parts, each mapping onto a process integral to the Andean Dead's museumification. Parts 2 and 3 are on exportation and the study of trepanation, and they rely on archives in 4 countries for its 19th and 20th century story. Its earlier chapters are more print-based, and I'm going to start with those. They explore a basic and important question. Why do we call Andean ancestors mummies anyway? Part 1 locates that beginning in the 16th century, with Spain's invasion of the Inca Empire of Tawantinsuyu, the most extensive empire in the world in its day, land empire. In this empire, the curing, care, and display of seated ancestors was a grammar of local history and imperial rule. At that system's apex were the male Inca emperors and their female consorts, whose innards were removed and flesh was covered with balsams. Here we're looking at Huayna Capac and Rawa Okyo, who was more than a consort. She was the chief priestess of the cult of the moon within the empire, being carried to Cusco around 1525. Again, they were Iapas. They were hardened, lightning-like beings that were paraded and consulted as if they were still alive. And they were, socially and cosmically speaking. Although an Inca's successor inherited the empire, its religious life was shaped by ancestors and their mostly female caretakers who enjoyed their estate. Beneath the Ayapas in the imperial system were the preserved remains of regional or local ancestors or lords. In the region of Cajatambo, as I've already said, they were called malquis, a plant to be transplanted, an etymology that helps us understand how they could also be divided, like a sectioned potato, to grow their descendants' fertility in other places. The Incas used this mobility of the dead to amplify their imperial power. If an ancestor became waka, a sacred thing, the Incas might bring them to Cusco to magnify their power and control over their descendants, a process that archaeologist George Lau describes as not unlike that of many colonial projects in world history, which filled the treasuries, museums, and zoos of expanding nations. The Incas also employed the imperial biopower of not letting some subjects fully die. Some bioarchaeologists have argued that the Inca imperial expansion made the preservation of the dead more widespread, and the empire sent the, quote, most perfect children of their subject lords to become capacucha, offerings to the cosmos, freezing atop 20,000-foot-high glacial peaks. So, given the varieties of ways of being and holding power, why do we call them mummies? Because of how the Spanish had to learn from Andean ways of being to attempt their domination. This process included conquistador violence against mummified Incas like Viracocha, whom Gonzalo Pizarro incinerated to ransom his gold and silver. They also burned them on bonfires as idolatries, a move that seems to have eliminated sacred and political roles for the Inca indigenous women who publicly maintained their cult. But 16th and 17th century chronicles and natural histories show how this domination was also a scientific process, by which agents of Spanish Empire compared and monetized the natural and cultural resources of the Americas. Spanish writers were interested in how the Inca dead were preserved. I found that from the 1530s, the Spanish crown was requesting samples of balsam of Peru, making it into a commodity. You can still purchase it today. I meet people every so often who's allergic to it. They can't have particular natural toothpaste because it's still a product used in pharmaceuticals. Identifying that balsam or an embalming agent or process was a way of desecrating them as well. It was a way of saying that these aren't sacred beings, they're objects of science, that they were produced through Inca know-how, but not because they were actually sacred. In 1559, a Spanish official named Polo de Ondegardo confiscated the extant illapas and displayed them in his house before sending them down to Lima. Once there, they were displayed in the hospital of San Andres, where Jesuits debated their means of preservation and even seem to have dissected some of them as well, leading to their disappearance in the 17th century. They were literally studied to death. These were the very first European-led confiscations and scientific displays of indigenous ancestors in the Americas, not in the 19th century United States, but in colonial Peru in the 16th century. They show how the collection and display of other people's ancestors across time has always involved both knowledge and power. The embalmed Incas lived on in print, though. Non-Iberians translated news of Inca embalming and mortuary wealth from the 16th century and recontextualized them with attributes of Peruvians or specifically the Peruvian chronicler El Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, the son of a Spaniard and a member of the Inca royal family. Garcilaso's chronicle spread the idea that the Incas embalmed their dead so well that, in the words of an English translator named Paul Reichout in 1688, quote, their bodies were more entire than the mummies, which is to say the Egyptians. Not everyone agreed with the comparison. Prior to the 18th century, a mummy in Europe only referred to the Egyptian and Near Eastern dead, reflecting a belief in the hermetic wisdom of ancient Egyptian embalming. But the debate over Inca embalming led to the invention of mummies as a global category. In 1749, in France's Histoire naturelle, an essay named Mummies included for the very first time any artificially preserved bodies of great age, making specific reference to Garcilaso's ancestors. It was a process of textual comparison that expanded the idea that it wasn't just the old world that could preserve the dead as well as the ancient Egyptians. In that same volume was Buffon's famed essay Varieties of the Human Species, which is where we start to intersect with the history of race and scientific racism. Some of us know it as one of scientific racism's, or articulation of scientific study of race, one of its earliest articulations. Buffon's essay deemed Mexico and Peru the most ancient lands of the continent, the most anciently peopled. So combined in this one volume, the assertion that the Incas made mummies and that Peru was anciently peopled made the Andes the front line for 18th century debates over American antiquity and civilization. It drove further grave opening. We're looking at the oldest diagram of how to excavate an indigenous interment in the Americas from 1748 by Jorge Juan and Antonio Ulloa, two Spanish officers that, as Neil has written about, in the mid-18th century participated in the French geodesic mission to Ecuador. In the 1770s, Ulloa also seems to have been the first to measure, or at least write about measuring, indigenous skulls to mount arguments of race. He provided the measurement of Andean skulls found in tombs like these to say that they were identical to those found in Louisiana, and that their number and supposed thickness indicated the general brutality and shallow inhabitation of indigenous Americans. This conversation, because it was a conversation, might be said to be where American archaeology and anthropology started. Sometimes, I know in some surveys of the history of archaeology in the United States, or North America, reaches back to Thomas Jefferson's state of Virginia. If you look at Jefferson's notes for the draft that he wrote, he was responding directly to Ulloa's claims about the antiquity and complexity of Inca South American monuments. Ulloa's essay on measuring indigenous antiquity and civilization using graves and skulls was also published in Philadelphia shortly after the American Revolution. It meant something else, though, back in Peru, where Creole intellectuals embraced the French claim that the Inca sovereigns were not just embalmed, but mummies. It led to their export as an example of Peruvian anatomical genius. In the 1790s, the Ilustrado Hipólito Unanue cited the mummies as evidence of the ancient Peruvian science's superiority to that of the Egyptians. The Peruvians perpetuated the life of their mummies, while the Egyptians only prolonged the death of their own. In the century that followed, scholars sought Inca mummies to debate that point and others. And again, South Americans led the way. In 1821, shortly after José de San Martín declared Peru's independence from Spain, the South American patriot sent Peru's first diplomatic gift, the mummy of a child, to the Museum of Buenos Aires, and to King George IV of England, an adult male Inca mummy for the British Museum. These gifts were meant to endear Rio de la Plata and England to Peru's cause, but they were also meant to transmit evidence of the sovereign Inca antiquity Peru had enjoyed, that San Martín hoped the royalty of Inglaterra might support. Their preservation answered some continental scholars' doubt at the complexity of Inca preservation, and their status as dead allowed Creole elites to claim the reins, essentially to say, the Incas are dead, we are their heirs. How they were received, though, gives us a hint at the instability of a mummified museum. In 1811, British museum curators had said that their Egyptian mummies were a harbor for dirt, only fit to be destroyed, and they donated several of them to the Hunterian Anatomical Museum of London's Royal Academy of Surgeons. The British Crown sent San Martin's Inca mummy there as well. It would not go in the British Museum. They deemed it less important for what it showed of Inca or Peruvian history and Peruvian sovereignty than its status as a curious specimen of racial preservation. Back in the Americas, though, Peru's intellectuals used their own museum project to present the Andean mummy as a pillar of national wealth and sovereignty. In 1826, Lima's National Museum opened 2 decades before the Smithsonian, with a mummy in every corner. The museum's founder, Mariano Eduardo de Rivero, published them in his 1851 book, Peruvian Antiquities, to send the message that what they represented was a Peruvian landscape whose minerals and nature was so particular and profitable that they preserved the dead. Peru was scientifically modern, the message, I interpret the message as being, and the proper place for ancient Andean bodies was a museum. Foreigners extended that lesson by visiting Peru's National Museum, then seeking their own mummies and skulls in the countryside. I found that by the late 1830s, the Peruvian government was supporting that project, trading away Andean mummies to foreign collectors and diplomats in displays of liberal scientific friendship, contributing to a growing diaspora of the Andean dead. Sometimes we think about the export of indigenous American artifacts and bodies as a failure of protection in the 19th century. But in Peru, it was a kind of success. State actors viewed the Andean dead as a resource that could extend the country's visible historical, scientific, and economic presence, particularly in the United States. The first 3 Andean mummies to reach the United States went to the Peale Museum in Philadelphia. I'm fairly sure that that delivery was an exchange with Peru's National Museum, and it reinforced the Peruvian dead's collection there in that very scientific American city, where by 1832 they outnumbered native North American skulls by nearly 4 to 1. Throughout the 19th century, Peruvian collectors and government officials represented their science and past by sending Andean bodies and artifacts to world's fairs, such as Philadelphia's Centennial Exposition of 1876, seen here. This Peruvian mummification of American museums and displays also shaped key matters of race. The female member of the Peale Museum's mummy family may have arrived in Boston without her head. Later on, that particular 3 were bought by P.T. Barnum and brought to the Boston Museum in the 1840s. The female mummy may have been headless because the white supremacist and craniologist Samuel George Morton had been allowed to decapitate her, defleshing and then measuring her with birdseed. She wasn't the only one. Morton's first book, Crania Americana, actually began as a treatise on the ancient Peruvians, who ended up filling more pages of its book than any other group. When Morton died in 1851, the largest population in his collection, today at the University of Pennsylvania, were the ancient Peruvians. No prior skull collector could claim so large a non-European set, and Morton used them to model how any supposedly ancient and modern skulls might be compared, to connect or contrast their race and civilization. The consequences of this Peruvian focus were profound. By treating Peruvians as America's ancient set, essentially as saying that these are the remains that we can know to have arrived before Europeans, and therefore they are racially pure, and they don't show any admixture that could complicate their measurement. So by treating the Peruvians as all of America's ancient set, Morton claimed that all indigenous Americans were biologically essentially the same over time. And by measuring and averaging Andean skulls, Morton showed how accumulation permitted more ambitious arguments. Through the 1830s, skull collections largely possessed the skulls of indigenous Americans as singular examples, a Seminole, a Cherokee, however horrific it is to say those words. Morton's work argued that the measurement of 150 Peruvians was better science. To debate or support Morton, other anthropologically minded scholars therefore joined the bone stampede, such that an 1863 article could feature over 20 citations on 22 citations for separate studies of Andean skulls and mummies since Peruvian independence. The first 11 specimens in the Smithsonian's first ethnological catalog were 8 Peruvian skulls and 3 Peruvian mummies, which led to this ghoulish scene, a stereograph of them seated on the grass outside of the National Mall, outside the Smithsonian, as a tourist view of Washington, D.C. This is essentially like an 1870s postcard. If you're approaching your limit on these images, so am I. When Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology opened in Cambridge in 1866, its largest original population was Peru's dead. Nearly 2/3 of the collection were from Peru and the Andes by the museum's 8th year. And the largest and most popular display in the field-defining anthropology exhibit of Chicago's Columbian Exposition of 1893, the famed World's Fair, were some 50 mummy bundles removed from Peru's necropolis of Ancon, whose excavation was the subject of the first PhD dissertation in anthropology written by a US citizen at Harvard. The mummies were displayed as if coming out of the ground to support the newly comparative and contextualized study of different modes of another people's mortuary practices, grave by grave. This was part of a shift in methodology that was advocated by Frederick Ward Putnam, that anthropology and archaeology needed to move from objects and their comparison in disparate contexts to context and ritual together. And the public responded. Although the anthropology department was overshadowed by the fair's more lively attractions, within its walls the necropolis attracted more attention than any other exhibit in the building. On July 4th, 1893, up to 30,000 fairgoers were drawn in to see the anthropology's, quote, most uncanny collection. Following Putnam's cue, the designer of this exhibit, the press took the fair's Andean collections as American antiquities key. Puebloan mummified remains were of interest because they showed that the story of early humanity also unfolded here in America, to take its place beside and confirm the Peruvian account of the early life of man on this continent. Most telling were 2 cartoons for the Sunday Chicago Herald. In one, 2 seated mummies faced each other playing a pre-Columbian shell game. In another, a Peruvian mummy plays pots like a battery of timpani drums, while a smoking monkey, a mammoth, fossils, a totem pole, and an Egyptian statue await their cue. It was as if all science at the fair was dancing to Harvard Anthropology's uncanny Andean beat. Peru afterwards became ground zero for what one Harvard anthropologist called mummy mining. The Andean and ancient Peruvian dead became the single largest populations at the American Museum of Natural History before 1920, the Field Museum, San Diego's Museum of Man. There, and in those places, became the centerpiece of South American halls of their own. At the Smithsonian, at least 4,851 of its nearly 31,000 individuals today remain from Peru, and their proportion is rising as other remains are returned. Foreign collectors did likewise. This created a diaspora of Andean ancestry that by the mid-20th century had become an almost unremarkable component of museums of anthropology and natural history worldwide. In the Andes, the consequences were heavy. grave opening was already happening before anthropology shined its gaze on the dead. It's one of the things that Morton benefited from, and he knew that he was benefiting from, that the coast was seen as accessible, and that as travelers claimed, indigenous people along the coast were participating in grave opening. This was an opportunistic use of Peru in a production line, essentially. The enshrinement of Morton's methods, though, not just objects, but mummies or skulls, as many as possible, generated looting as well, exhausting pre-Hispanic cemeteries along the Peruvian coast. It also extended into the highlands, taking up remains that local people still saw as ancestral. I also believe that accelerated the looting of populations outside of Peru. What the ancient Peruvians provided Americanist anthropology was a stable and scientific core around which other people's ancestors were amassed in larger and larger numbers. It's fitting then that as Andean mummies and skulls became common in museums across the Atlantic world, they inspired increasingly universal existential art. One particularly famous example in Paris inspired Gauguin, but also some art historians claim Munch's The Scream. If so, it's the most famous Peruvian mummy in history, and the existential dread it expresses is not simply that of Munch, it's that of the ancestors themselves, dislocated to places like Boston or Paris, and then who then became so unremarkable that they could fade into the larger cultural landscape, another flavor of Western horror, that disinterred became creepy and comic, as in the case of Raskar Kapak, an Inca mummy who haunted the dreams of Belgian boy reporter Tintin in the 1940s, or more recently, Ampata, the Inca mummy girl who in 1997 fought Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I know I'm jumping around in time. I'm doing so in part to emphasize that this is the world we're still in. Ampata was inspired by the ice mummy Juanita, found on the sacred mountain Ampato, whom the government of Alberto Fujimori allowed to tour abroad in the 1990s, an example of the Peruvian government's continued willingness to engage in the mummy diplomacy of the uncanny Andean dead. We were hit by the ripples of this story last year when a Mexican ufologist showed Mexico's Congress what he said were the mummified remains of two unidentified forms of life, supposedly found in Peru near the pre-Columbian Nazca lines. I've written about how these mummified aliens are part of a larger and more elaborate hoax going on since 2017 that has taken the actual remains of Andean bodies and combined them with the remains of animals to appeal to those inclined to find something alien in Andean forms. But it's also because of how museum builders in Peru and the US taught us to view the dead, from San Martin's Inca mummy to National Geographic. We're perhaps sold this because we've already bought this, to which a feeling person might ask why the Andean ancestors should remain on display at all. Why not let the screen go blank to return them to whence they came? Here, we again have to contend with other national histories than our own. The South American curator of Vienna's Weltmuseum recently told me that they had entertained a visit to the museum by Peru's new ambassador to Austria. And the museum's director asked if Austria could return the Peruvian mummies it had in storage, some still in their display cases. According to the curator, the ambassador's reply was no. He wanted the Weltmuseum Wien to instead put those mummies on display in a Peruvian room of their own, like those dedicated to Mexico and Brazil. What if another country's dead wants to see the dead from its country on display? In the third part of my book, I try to think around and through this complication by highlighting how Andean Peruvians have shaped this story as well. They sometimes did so by contesting the looting of their dead. In the 16th century, after the Spanish invasion, they sometimes concealed the ancestors, continuing their divine cult. But they also made the surprising choice of disinterring them for their own reasons, sometimes anti-colonial ones, identifying them as victims of colonization or as powerful actors that could still harm and heal. In some places, they continue to be described as abuelitos, or beautiful grandparents. The Italian-Peruvian geographer Antonio Raimondi reported that in the 1860s, communities in Huarochirí, near Lima, were bringing ancestral remains down from the mountains to influence the rains. In other places, like around Cusco, the ancestors can be called suka, not ancestors, but dangerous beings from an earlier time that should be left alone, or if looted, engaged with, left in offerings so that they don't curse the living. On the Peruvian coast, Peruvians of Andean and African descent became expert huaqueros, or grave openers. But again, there could be a reciprocal element to it, a relationship with the dead that did not include collecting the dead, collecting their objects, but leaving offerings to the dead. So to speak of Andean people's relationship to the dead as one thing is an oversimplification. It's the sort of oversimplification that the Spanish used to justify their destruction in the 17th century. But we can see how in some places, participation in grave opening transformed identity and crafted radical Peruvian histories of care. One of those places was Huarochirí, where one particular recovery of the dead as personal, medical, and scientific ancestors challenges our idea of what a mummified museum could be. This story hinges on an individual named Julio César Tello, who grew up in Huarochirí. He was the only member of his family to go to school and university in Lima, where he studied surgery. He got a grant to study at Harvard's Peabody Museum, where he earned his AM in anthropology in 1911, probably making him Harvard's first Peruvian student. He then returned to Peru to become the signal archaeologist of his generation in Peru in the 20th century. I can't do justice to his complexity today. For his achievements, he's been called the father of Peruvian archaeology, or even America's first indigenous archaeologist. What I want to underline, though, is how he complicates our understanding of American museums and anthropology. If we think of him not as a beginning, a father or a first, but as a son, a student and heir to a centuries-long process of mummification in American museums. Tello came to the United States to train in American museums, specifically because he already saw his own family legacies inside of them. In 1900, when he was a medical student, his hand fell upon a volume of the papers of the Bureau of American Ethnology that was at the Peruvian National Library, and he opened it to a page with a skull that he recognized. This skull, the one that we're looking at, had originally been collected by his father, a small-town gobernador. The skull was trepanned, a cranial surgery that Inca healers had excelled at before the Spanish invasion. Tello's father had given the skull to Peru's Surgeon General, who brought it to the Chicago World's Fair to convince American anthropologists that it represented Peruvian diagnostic medicine and healing, that it wasn't an object of race, but an example of how Andean people had cured themselves long before the Spanish arrived. Afterwards, this skull and the 18 others went to the Smithsonian, where an American ethnologist published it, but he flipped its meaning. He published it as an example of barbaric quackery, of fake medicine, with no mention of Tello's father, who was likely written out by the Surgeon General as well. In other words, what was represented by this picture of a skull that Tello himself had held, that his father had collected, was a twice-hidden inheritance. That of his father, who had participated in the collection and perhaps celebration of the embodied Andean past, and that of the people Tello understood to be his actual ancestors in Huarochirí, the place that he was from, whose surgical skill was being denied by American anthropologists who wanted to see skulls instead as objects of uncivilization. So Tello became an anthropologist, specifically one who collected the people he imagined were his ancestors or believed were his ancestors. He went on to collect 400 more skulls like the one his father had collected, and he brought them to Cambridge to continue his study. He published on them, and after he sold them to Harvard with his name attached, he returned to Peru, where he founded the country's first 3 archaeological museums in the city. At stake here was his career, but also an approach to the ancestral dead that understood all Andean peoples, and not just Incas or Europeans, as heir to a culture of medicine and care, in which a skull was not something to racialize or measure, but something to heal. Those anthropological museums featured sculptures, artifacts, but also the dead, whom, in the first ones at least, he lined up in cases. And this work by him also shows us how a museum's mummification can challenge the white and European supremacy that could deny Andean history. The white director of the National Museum at the time called Tello el Indio, claiming that he was looting huacas high on coca. And he charged that Tello's anthropology and museum projects threatened to, quote, crush the history of colonial and independent Peru, that is Spanish Peru, under the folkloric weight of a ridiculous imperialism exercised by mummies. I'll say that another way. He was saying that what Andean mummies challenged in the museum was the importance of Spanish and European influence upon the nation's identity and history. And more than any other individual, Teo went on to push Peruvian governments to become responsible for the dead's care. He helped craft a 1929 law that for the first time asserted Peru's outright ownership of ancient Andean ancestral remains, making them impossible to export without government permission. He hoped that law would protect the dead, such as at Paracas on the Peruvian coast, which Teo made famous when he and his excavators removed 429 mummy bundles, most around 2,000 years old, to save them from looting. Among them were the oldest trepan skulls then found in the Andes, along with what Teo believed were a surgeon's obsidian blades. He then brought those mummy bundles to his museums, where he represented those Paracans as the scientific ancestors of the Peruvian nation, experts in surgery and mummification, whose legacy of healing had been overshadowed by both Inca and Spanish Empire and denied by North American anthropology. Teo, again, was complicated. He was an unabashed nationalist. He celebrated the scientific founders of Peru that he saw as extending into the past. He did so in an anthropology that wanted to vouchsafe respect for, quote, Indians like himself. He also unwrapped these mummies for North American visitors. He so fervently believed in this work of curation of pre-Inca scientific ancestors that he had his own dead body interred alongside them in the backyard of his museum beneath the replica of a 2-million-year-old stone deity. Teo's countrymen in Huarochirí, though, believed that those very mummies had killed him, that his work had cursed him. So, what do we do with so sprawling a history in which actors are folding the ancestral dead and, into such disparate and different subjects of empire, race, nation, and healing, desecrating them and mummifying them in turn? In Peru, citizens and scholars have answered Teo's call by soldiering on in the fields of archaeology, moving into calling the Peruvian government to account for the more recent deaths and disappearances of Andean communities since the political violence of the 1980s. Museums in Peru are still spaces that can threaten the status quo. Why else would Lima's right-wing mayor shut down last year the city's only museum dedicated to mourning the violence of the 1980s and 1990s, just as it was about to host Amnesty International's release of its report documenting the state's murderous repression of last year's protests? The character of Peruvian museums are also changing. On the one hand, national institutions have been less inclined to display the Andean dead. There's also been a profusion of local museums that have taken up that role. In some cases that I know of, in which a community seeks to achieve the return of remains from a distant museum, it's so that they can mount a museum of their own. And as they learn of the existence of the massive Andean diaspora abroad, wider requests might come. That they may include the mummification of their own museums challenges our perspective on what these repatriations are supposed to do and how they might go. What can we do here in the United States to recognize this shared history? One thing is to recognize it. It's reckoning with how to see these entanglements of violence and healing in a way that can heal further and not harm. For that reason, my book begins and ends with the Smithsonian's first Hall of Physical Anthropology, which opened in 1965. And the first thing a visitor saw in this collection was, until the mid-1980s, this wall of 160 ancient Peruvian skulls arranged like a mushroom cloud. Their bloom visualized how humanity's population had, quote, exploded since the beginning of the Christian era. Every 3 crania in this skull wall represented 100 million people. 9 skulls at the bottom represented 300 million believed alive in 1 AD, while the thunderhead of 106 at the top were the 3.5 billion humans alive in the space age. The Washington Post asked the director of the museum why they had chosen Peruvian Indian skulls to embody the biggest thing anthropology could possibly say about recent humanity. His answer was, because we had so many of them. He wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong. The hall used ancient Peruvians to explain everything from artificial cranial shaping to the variation of forms for the word the exhibit was using in place of race, as well as mummification. In almost all cases, Andean remains were there as illustrations, with no consideration of why they had been cared for or preserved or how they got there. This was a flattening of indigenous and Andean history into American anthropology and its timescales, from the beginning of the Christian era to the space age, that helps us understand why the skull wall was taken down in the 1980s, when indigenous North American pressure on the museum was growing. That decision was the right one. A recognition that a cloud of skulls was as much an evocation of death and genocide as humanity's growth. But it also made that violence less visible, which meant that America's Peruvian community, which grew mostly after the 1980s, lost sight of their literal precedence in the nation's capital, which also included a history that could heal. Because what also went down with the skull wall was the hall's display on trepanation, which presented the implements that were used by Andean healers and skulls with 5, even 7 holes, suggesting Andean skill at this high-risk maneuver. What also went into storage was this 7 by 11 foot painting by a Connecticut artist named Alton Tobey. The Smithsonian sent Tobey to South America to study trepanation, and his painting depicted an Inca surgeon at work, operating a patient's skull at the Inca royal estate of Machu Picchu, Indigenous America's most ambitious surgical technique, perhaps, framed by Peru's most iconic architectural site. But hidden in Tobey's painting was also the history of how Andean and Peruvian scholars had made Andean curing visible, in part by studying their dead and mummifying their museums. For inspiration, the Smithsonian directed Tobey to refer to this painting, Trephaning in Ancient Peru, which was one of 85, quote, great moments in the history of medicine, painted for a pharmaceutical magazine in the 1950s. Here, however, the scene was set not at tourist-friendly Machu Picchu, but at the coastal site of Paracas, the burial ground, a burying ground over 1,500 years older than Machu Picchu and famed, as I've already said, because of Teo. It was from Paracas that Teo had extracted 429 mummy bundles, who he brought to his museum to serve as the model for his mannequins, draped with their textiles, to visualize living peoples whose point was not the shape of their skulls, but the care with which they had been healed and preserved, as experts in trepanation, art, as he believed the computation of time, long before their achievements were mummified by Inca, Spanish, or American Empire. Teo's mannequin had been the model for the pharmaceutical ad, which is in turn was the model for Tobey, which borrowed the broadest contributions of Teo's work, while bearing its intellectual and political vision of what it meant to turn a museum into a place with scientific ancestors who weren't just imperial Incas, whose descendants belonged in American and Peruvian science society as neither objects nor informants, but as crafters of culture, knowledge, and care. My point here is that a broader history of the collection of the dead in the Americas certainly reveals colonialism's compounded nature, in which centuries of structural violence and transnational intellectual practices racialized ancestors and made them lootable, and now today commits researchers to reapproaching their descendants. But it also reveals the effects of Peruvian history, in which Andean peoples have for millennia cared for their ancestors and those of others. Making that care manifest doesn't mean putting a skull wall back up, but Teo's mural is ripe for an invitation to advertise these connections and their intervention in museums in a way that helps us understand this wider America. It can help us think about how our globalizing sciences still contain the remains of those ancestors, very literally. And by seeing their local arts of collection and care, how we can find a history and present in which antecedents or ancestors can be recollected as embodying a diversity of relationships to descendants. The historian Alberto Flores Galindo once wrote, "Andean people are not caught in some impossible museum." When we acknowledge that they helped make those museums, their passage in and out of their doors, helps us let go of the idea of a museum as a monolith. Death is not the end for museums, it's only the beginning. And it helps us understand how the descendants who care for them, museums and mummies alike, remain in Lima or America, because they've been here a very long time. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to questions. Before I go, it would be wonderful, Gabriela will read a passage from the first chapter of her book that I think will also set a good tone for the conversation.
Hola, hello. Lo más extraño de estar sola aquí, en París, en la sala de un museo etnográfico, casi debajo de la Torre Eiffel, es pensar que todas esas figurillas que se parecen a mí fueron arrancadas del patrimonio cultural de mi país por un hombre del que llevo el apellido. Mi reflejo se mezcla en la vitrina con los contornos de estos personajes de piel marrón, ojos como pequeñas heridas brillantes, narices y pómulos de bronce tan pulidos como los míos, hasta formar una sola composición, hierática, naturalista. Un tatarabuelo es apenas un vestigio en la vida de alguien, pero no si éste se ha llevado a Europa la friolera de 4.000 piezas precolombinas, y su mayor mérito es no haber encontrado Machu Picchu, pero haber estado cerca. El Museo de Quebran Lee se encuentra en el 7º distrito, en el centro del muelle del mismo nombre, y es uno de esos museos europeos que acogen grandes colecciones de arte no occidental de América, Asia, África y Oceanía, o sea que son museos muy bonitos, levantados sobre cosas muy feas, como si alguien creyera que pintando los techos con diseños de arte aborigen australiano y poniendo un montón de palmeras en los pasillos, nos fuéramos a sentir un poco como en casa y a olvidar que todo lo que hay aquí debería estar a miles de kilómetros, incluyéndome. He aprovechado un viaje de trabajo para venir por fin a conocer la colección de Charles Wiener. Cada vez que entro a sitios como este, tengo que resistir las ganas de reclamarlo todo como mío y pedir que me lo devuelvan en nombre del Estado peruano. Una sensación que se vuelve más fuerte en la sala que lleva mi apellido y que está llena de figuras de cerámicas antropomorfas y zoomorfas de diversas culturas prehispánicas de más de 1000 años de antigüedad. Sigo. Intento encontrar alguna propuesta de recorrido, algo que contextualice las piezas en el tiempo, pero están exhibidas de manera inconexa y aislada y nombradas solo con inscripciones vagas o genéricas. Le hago varias fotos al muro en el que se lee Misión de M. Wiener, como cuando viajé a Alemania y vi con dudosa satisfacción mi apellido por todas partes. Wiener es uno de esos apellidos derivados de lugares como Epstein, Auerbach o Ginsberg. Algunas comunidades judías solían adaptar los nombres de sus ciudades y pueblos por una cuestión afectiva. Wiener es un gentilicio, significa de Viena, en alemán, como las salchichas. Tardo unos segundos en darme cuenta de que la M es la M de Messier. Aunque la suya haya sido la misión científica del típico explorador del siglo XIX, suelo bromear en las cenas de amigos con la idea de que mi tatarabuelo era un huaquero de alcance internacional. Les llamo huaqueros, sin eufemismos, a los saqueadores de yacimientos arqueológicos que extraen y trafican hasta el día de hoy con bienes culturales y artísticos. Pueden ser señores muy intelectuales o mercenarios y pueden llevar tesoros milenarios a museos de Europa o a los salones de sus casas criollas en Lima. La palabra huaquero viene del quechua huaca o huaca, como se le llaman en los Andes, a los lugares sagrados que hoy son en su mayoría sitios arqueológicos o simplemente ruinas. En sus catacumbas solían estar enterradas las autoridades comunales junto a su ajuar funerario. Los huaqueros invaden sistemáticamente estos recintos buscando tumbas u objetos valiosos y a causa de sus métodos poco profesionales suelen dejarlas hechas un muladar. El problema es que semejante procedimiento no permite ningún estudio posterior fiable. Hace imposible rastrear cualquier seña de identidad o memoria cultural para reconstruir el pasado. De ahí que huaquear sea una forma de violencia. Convierte fragmentos de historia en propiedad privada para el atrezo y decoración de un ego. A los huaqueros también les hacen películas en Hollywood, como a los ladrones de cuadros. Son fechorías no exentas de glamour. Wiener, sin ir muy lejos, ha pasado a la posteridad no solo como estudioso, sino como autor de esta colección de obras, borrando a sus autores reales y anónimos, arropado por la coartada de la ciencia y el dinero de un gobierno imperialista. En aquella época, a mover un poco de tierra lo llamaban arqueología. Fin. Ya, listo.
The strangest thing about being alone here in Paris in an anthropology museum gallery more or less beneath the Eiffel Tower is the thought that all these statuettes that look like me were wrenched from my country by a man whose last name I inherited. My reflection in the display case mixes with the outlines of these figures with brown skin, eyes like small, bright wounds, and polished bronze noses and cheekbones identical to mine, forming a solemn, naturalist composition. A great-great-grandfather is just a relic in a person's life, unless the man in question took the not insignificant sum of 4,000 pre-Columbian artifacts to Europe. And his greatest achievement was that he didn't find Machu Picchu, though he came close. The Musée du Quai Branly is in the 7th arrondissement, right in the center of an old quay of the same name. It's one of those European museums that houses large collections of non-Western art from the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Oceania. In other words, a very pretty museum built on something very ugly. It's like someone thought that painting the ceiling with Aboriginal art and sticking a few palm trees in the corridor would help us feel at home and forget that everything in this place should be thousands of kilometers away from here, including me. I took advantage of a work trip to finally visit the Charles Wiener collection. When I walk into a place like this, I always fight the urge to claim everything in it as my own and demand it all back in the name of the Peruvian state. A feeling that only grows in this gallery, which bears my surname and brims with ancient anthropomorphic and zoomorphic clay forms from various pre-Columbian cultures. I look around for a suggested route, a timeline to ground the objects, but they're displayed randomly, in isolation, their labels vague or generic. I take several photos of the wall with the words Mission de Monsieur Wiener, just like I did when I went to Germany, and felt a dubious satisfaction at seeing my family name everywhere I looked. Wiener is one of those surnames derived from a place, like Epstein, Auerbach, and Günzberg. Some Jewish communities adopted the names of their cities or towns for sentimental reasons. Wiener is a demonym that means from Vienna in German, just like the sausage. It takes me a second to realize that the M stands for Monsieur. Even though his mission was just your garden variety 19th century scientific expedition, at dinner with friends I often joke that my great-great-grandfather was a vaquero of international repute. Vaquero is not a euphemism. It's how I refer to the looters who to this day remove cultural and artistic properties from archaeological sites. Vaqueros can range from cultured gentlemen to mercenaries, and these ancient treasures can end up in European museums or the sitting rooms of their elegant criollo houses in Lima. The term vaquero, meaning grave robber in Spanish, comes from huaca in Quechua. This is what people in the Andes call their sacred places, most of which are now archaeological sites or ruins. Community leaders and their funerary offerings are buried in catacombs at these sites. Vaqueros systematically invade them in search of tombs and priceless objects, and their incompetence is so great that they leave the sites a complete mess. These violations affect the reliability of subsequent research, making it impossible to reconstruct the past out of traces of identity and cultural memory, which is why to vaquear is a form of violence. It turns fragments of history into private property that accessorizes and dresses up the ego. Like art thieves, vaqueros are the heroes of Hollywood movies. There is a touch of glamour to their mischief. Wiener himself has gone down in history not only as a scholar, but as the author of this collection, erasing its real, anonymous provenance with science as his alibi and the financial backing of an imperialist government. Back then, you just had to move some dirt around to call it archaeology. So thank you for your forbearance to listen to Gabriela's work as well. We'll open this up to questions and conversations, and indeed a dialogue, which we didn't have the chance to have as fully as we would have liked in the class this afternoon. So I encourage you to ask questions related to Chris's presentation, but also very much to ask questions about the different kinds of experiences that we all have in confronting these kinds of objects. in the various places throughout the world that these objects exist. In fact, one of the questions that came to my mind, Chris, when you were presenting, was the different kinds of reception, because I know that you have been on tour to some extent, and have been at Harvard and also at Yale, where these objects and the infamous collections of archaeology and anthropology have a very famed but also a very complex history. I wonder if if you have a sense of how the different kinds of audiences also affect the way that they're listening to these stories.
Thank you, Neil. It's been interesting because museums have moved at different, and institutions have moved at different paces on this. And there is also, I think, a little bit of an experience with, for example, the Yale Peruvian collection, which is the subject of my first book, of that being treated as an exception and not a larger condition of the process of collecting that filled other museums as well. And in some ways it was an exceptional moment in the sense that was the first time the Peruvian government said, this collection can leave the country, but then it has to come back. And that was a watershed moment in Peruvian cultural patrimony and archaeology. But what I tried to do with this book was think about how it was embedded in this longer history of collecting. And so one of the things that was very important for me to do when I talked at Harvard was to contextualize what it meant that Bingham was doing those expeditions after the World's Fair at Chicago, and how Bingham, and this is what I talked about at Yale, got to Machu Picchu in the first place. He was sent an article written by Carlos Romero, who's an archivist at the National Library, but he was sent an article detailing where the last cities of the Inca were. The person who sent him that article was Julio Cesar Teo, whom I ended the presentation with. Teo sent it to Bingham. Bingham got the idea to go back to Peru and made his way to Machu Picchu. Teo, however, had asked to participate on that expedition, and Bingham ignored the request. And so what I think this story is as much about, and what I think has been really generative for conversations, is that there's a narrative about it that I think my book does partake in, which is this is a long story of extraction, and that can be understood as extensions of colonialism. But it's also about attempted collaboration and work between Andean scholars like Teo, who wanted his society known and respected, with foreigners, and not getting that respect, realizing that Peruvian laws might have to change. And I think thinking of this as a connected story that is, a story that has something to do with the story of NAGPRA here in the U.S., but that is also entangled with it. It's been useful to talk about. I found people have been really receptive to it, especially because it's, I think, one of the, one of the messages that is sometimes here from Peruvian colleagues working in archaeology is that the state is starving some of its museums of funding, and so there is a need for support and solidarity from colleagues on that front, and that there might be a desire for return, but it's not the only issue.
I'm wondering, Gabriela, if I could ask you a similar question, because I know that you have also been presenting this work at different museum collections, especially those museum collections that have objects and items from Peru. How has your reception been at that in terms of reading this work? How have people reacted to it?
Mm-hmm. La reacción sobre todo del mundo
Los museos.
de los museos,
sí,
¿no?
sí, sí, de los diferentes museos que has visitado y
Sí.
las lecturas que has hecho.
Sí, como explicaba hace un rato en tu clase, fue algo involuntario e inesperado. De repente había, pero claro, ahora me parece lógico, pero mi libro pues captó la atención evidentemente del mundo arqueológico y de los museos, y he terminado presentando varios de mis libros, por ejemplo en el Museo Etnográfico de Bolonia, por ejemplo en el Museo Etnográfico de Santiago de Chile. Digamos, estoy persiguiendo la idea de poder presentarlo en el Quebranlí, que es el Museo del Libro, pero aún no se ha logrado. Quizá este museo, que en realidad, como te contaba el otro día, fue fundado por Jacques Chirac, es decir, que es un museo pagado por el progresismo francés, no por la derecha, le cuesta más, ¿no? Darse cuenta que de repente estaban equivocados.
So, Gabriela is saying that the experience of presenting in these different museums was unexpected. It was not something that she sought out when writing this book. But as a result of the nature of the book, she's been given the opportunity to present in Bologna and other places, but not yet at the Musée du Quai Branly, which is where this book begins. And for her, it is somewhat ironic, given the fact that Chirac, the government of Jacques Chirac, socialist government, was the sort of the impulse behind the creation of the museum, that they're still trying to contend with the fact that they may not have done the right thing by creating the kind of museum that they have. And I will add, just personally, for those of you who might not have been to that museum, it is an extremely aestheticized museum. And in fact, you recount this very clearly, that there are no labels, there are no sort of descriptions of what it is that you're actually looking at. And that is absolutely by design. That the idea is that these items and objects are, of this kind of, aesthetic level, that they should be compared to the finest works of art anywhere, and that do not require any description. But of course, they do.
En la portada de uno de los catálogos del Quebranlí aparece la cara de Jacques Chirac con su huaco retrato, que es una máscara africana, ¿no? En la que es una especie de fotoilustración en la que su cara se medio desdobla y se convierte en una máscara africana de madera.
Right. Gabriel is saying that one of the at the cover of one of the magazines, Jacques Chirac appears with a mask, an African mask that is essentially the Wako retrato of Jacques Chirac, and it sort of blends together with this image in a very spooky kind of way.
Including the ancestor that is believed to have, well, certainly inspired Paul Gauguin, and some suggest inspired Munch. That mummy is still on display, and it's one of the icons that shows up if you go to at least a year or two ago, if you went to the museum's website, it was one of the first things that hit you. And there have been fights between Belgium and France over whose mummy inspired Raskar Kapak from Tintin, the comic, where they stop being Peruvian and they start being part of global culture, and stop being human as well in that sense.
Me interesó mucho la parte en la que hablas del cuidado de las momias. Conecté mucho porque en mi libro, todo el primer capítulo, creo que lo que hay es un sentimiento de un arrebato por tratar de salvar a esas momias, de darles afecto, de darles ternura. Incluso la protagonista de la novela dice: me lo quiero robar, con dando unos balazos y sacarla de ahí, ¿no? En uno de los museos donde presenté el libro, en Santiago de Chile, de hecho, quienes me invitaron y estaban haciendo la curaduría eran descendientes de mapuches, y me contaban que muchísima gente mapuche, de la comunidad mapuche, indígenas o descendientes de indígenas, van muchísimo al museo para hacer ritualidad, ¿no? Para alrededor de según qué piezas que tienen una potencia y y un poder, ¿no? Incluso estando dentro de su país, dentro de un museo de su país etnográfico, están pues... está roto, ¿no? Se intenta romper ese vínculo y sin embargo la comunidad lo va rememorando, lo actualiza, y es interesante lo que pasa en cuanto a nuestra vinculación con los objetos y mucho más con los restos humanos. Te contaba que en España, por ejemplo, está esta momia Paracas en el Museo de América, y el otro día en un podcast que hice, ya que había leído que en la web del ministerio se decía que las momias no serían expuestas si alguna comunidad la reclamaba, se me ocurrió reclamar a la momia Paracas como mi abuelita. A ver si funcionaba. Aún estoy esperando.
Sure. Gabriela said one of the things that most affected her about in thinking with some of the examples I had was the desire to care for the encountered ancestor or the mummified baby, and that's something that she's also found in conversations, in presentations in Chile with the Mapuche, that the desire is to enter these spaces and to care for the things that have been pulled away from them. I know I'm really summarizing, but recently for a podcast that Gabriela did, she did a tour of the Museo de America in Madrid, where they have a Paracas mummy on display that is sort of a false Paracas mummy that's sort of a side that was made to sort of evoke a Paracas mummy. But there is a mummy inside of it. It's just reconstructed. Sorry, into the weeds. But she said, she wanted to, she said on the podcast she wanted to reclaim it as her abuelita, as her beautiful grandmother. And it's important.
Bueno, tengo una amiga en París, que es la que me acompaña siempre al Quai Branly para hacer nuestras visitas semestrales. Y me dijo que pues en París, en una de las plazas principales de París, hay un obelisco, bueno, de hecho lo vimos, un obelisco que es egipcio, ¿no? Y ella, que es astróloga, bueno, básicamente sí, te lee el tarot y absolutamente todo, sabe toda esta astrología. Me dice que una de las causas de que el mundo esté como esté actualmente es que ese monolito no ha vuelto a su lugar de origen. Que las energías están... Hay ¿cómo se dice? Un desequilibrio energético. Porque eso sigue ahí, atravesado de coches y calles y gente.
Creo que es el Place Vendôme, right?
Yeah,
It's the
right.
Place Vendôme, which is Gabrielle is saying that the part with her friend that she's gone to visit Paris and the Quai Branly, they make a pilgrimage every 6 months to the Place Vendôme to see the Egyptian column, and it is as a result of that Egyptian column still being there and the kind of disequilibrium of the energies that still is creating all of the problems and challenges that we see in the world today.
Es completamente serious.
I think that's one of the things that Teo was doing with his obelisk over his grave. I mean, he was not buried in he was buried in the sort of the Cementerio Presbítero for a year, but then he made sure that he had his friends say, where I want to be buried is in the back of the museum. And the choice of having it be not under a cross, not under but under a 2,000-year-old feline god in the middle of Lima, I think it's also a provocation of how things out of place can sort of reclaim space as well. I'm not sure the obelisk turns France into Egypt, and there is a disequilibrium there, but that I think the conclusion shouldn't be that there shouldn't be presence, but that it should be sort of elected and chosen and consulted with to create that presence. I realize we could keep talking for a while.
Luego.
I did want to give people a chance in the audience to ask any questions or make any comments that they would like to make. Yes, Aditya, with the microphone.
Thank you so much for coming. I just had a quick question in regards to like repatriation and like cultural diplomacy for Professor Heaney. So I know that maybe around 10 years ago, Yale began the process of giving back a lot of the stuff that they got from the Hiram Bingham expedition, and they started like giving it back to Peru and like making a joint institute. I was just wondering if you could kind of speak to repatriation as a tool of cultural diplomacy, and like if it can trigger healing, and just your thoughts on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good question. And as I understand it, all the materials from the 1912 expedition, which were the ones from Machu Picchu, have gone back, both objects and grave goods and human remains. And they're in La Casa Concha, which is a converted house in downtown Cusco. The house is run by the UNSAC, the Universitario Nacional de San Antonio de Abad del Cusco, the Cusco's university. Yale also has a significant presence, at least logistically, in some of the objects' storage, and or at least that's the belief that people I've talked to in Cusco, that there is a perception that the objects have returned, and that Peru succeeded in its national campaign. There were conditions with that return that provide for collaboration between the Cusco University and Yale. But outside of that relationship, people, for example, who work for the Ministerio in Cusco, as well as those in the university don't have connection to the Yale group, feel like, I mean, to put it bluntly, I heard somebody say in a talk, that after a talk I gave, that they felt like they still hadn't returned, that they were there in Cusco physically, but that the access, which wasn't just sort of symbolic and geographical, but also scientific, that the desire is not just to have them as trophies, but to be able to study them and value them as they were in the U.S., hadn't been achieved, or at least wasn't accessible. This is a couple people I heard say this, and so this is not, it can't be magnified to that this is the global perception, but I think we're over 10 years on, and there's sort of lessons in how it can be, how it can heal some breaches, like the university and the state, and a local, some individuals in the local university, but that there are other ways to extend it, and so it's another reason for me, like why repatriation is not always the answer that people. It's not always the question that people are asking. It's access, support, respect, often, which can sometimes include care in the place where they are now, and exchange, and also sometimes return. But it's something that I can't speak for everyone here, but like from an outsider view and sort of talking to enough people, it's there's a feeling that these sorts of conversations are good, but they can't just be conversations, too. Thank you for the great question.
Maybe you can ask, because we are running short on time. So just go. We'll load up these both the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for this excellent talk. I always enjoyed reading your work, and thank you to Gabriela for reading a passage of the book. I'm going to go buy it. I really appreciate the last comment that you made about just the complexity of the situation too, and that repatriation may not be enough. And it got me thinking, because I've been thinking about this for a couple weeks now. We attended a talk a couple weeks ago with a Peruvian director of a museum, and it's a private museum, so not necessarily run by the state. And at one point, and they have access to ancestral remains, and at one point they made a comment, the director, about how they have working mummies because they sent it off to loan to different museums worldwide. So it's a Peruvian museum, of course, you know, ancestral remains that are being then managed to go abroad, which I feel like it's like the contradiction of what we're, I guess, the majority of the, or the latter part of the conversation is to bring people home.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, if sometimes when I work in Peru, sometimes when I have to follow the guidelines from the Ministerio de Cultura, it does feel a bit like a lot of bureaucracy, a very sanitized, very, like, it's as if the scientific thought has been adopted and then taken to an extreme at times, where I think there's a bit of separation between these offices and then recognizing the local practices that are very much believed, lived, and acted today about ancestral remains, about wakas and sites. And so I wonder if we can talk a little bit about, like, internally, like, a lot of the colonial thinking that still remains that kind of impact the kind of care that that I think you're describing, that you're hoping to see in the future, where, you know, within Peru, these people and their remains can be treated the way they were perhaps intended to be treated once they were dead or beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. That's a big question. It's an extension of the colonial story. It's also an extension of 19th century state-to-state relations. And I think one way to think about Peruvian law as it develops is in response to foreign laws and practices. Because, you know, you go back to the 19th century, and I think it's important to realize that the Peruvian state is exporting mummies or allowing their export for recognition between national states and scientific ones, and it's it's a role that the state slipped into very easily with independence. The claiming them as something that has to be in a museum run by the state. That's a different wave that comes in the 20th century, I think, and it comes out of, I think, the 1929 law by Theo, which is itself in response to foreign interest and export of everything. Like it's in some ways it's a response to contextual archaeology that, like, they're not just taking pots, they're taking everything down to the los tiestos, to the potsherds, and so the state is, I think, articulating this role in contradistinction to international regimes. And what that does, I think, locally is maintain precisely the thing you're talking about, which is sort of this overshadowed expertise from the cities. And there it's really hard. I mean, there's the growth of community museums. I think it's also the recognition that there are site museums. It's also recognition that there are community museums that already exist, that are sometimes set up in a school. That, you know, I know some archaeologists have a lot of trouble with, because it's sort of an extension of the logic of building a museum by a local teacher who's inspired and wants to expose students to the past, and they do it sometimes by bringing a mummy into, like, the collection in the school. And there's a way that, you know, sometimes the state or archaeologists can look at that as sort of like, isn't this just looting? Or they don't see it as a reflection of what, like, another museum does. But I think understanding these things as you know, as to Gabriela's point, it's sort of like, is all of this just wakeo? The way that also moves back through is that it's, even if we sort of like have, you know, questions about that it does get to, like, there is sort of a knowledge and relation making that is happening already without the state. And I think recognizing that, and I think starting with not necessarily building a new museum, but seeing what, like, a community has already done, and figuring out how to support that is one way. But it's incredibly hard. You know, and It's a matter of funding. It's a matter of political will. All sorts of things that you and I shouldn't have control over. Yeah.
Peter.
Well, my question has partially been answered, but it has to do with practices in Peru today. Are human remains on display? And is there an internal dialogue about the appropriateness of displaying them and perhaps certain sacred objects, the way there has been here before NAGPRA and after?
Yes, there is. Well, I would say not in terms of sacred objects. There's the museum of the Senor de Sipan up on the north coast, and the entire museum is built like what is understood or believed to be the Waka from which the Lord of Sipan was visited, and you progress as you move down in the museum to the reconstruction of the burial. And I'm forgetting whether or not there are replica remains there, but the objects are real, though. And one of the chief deities of Pachacamac on the coast, sort of a wooden staff god, is certainly on display at the Site Museum of Pachacamac. The Site Museum of Pachacamac does not have any human remains on display, and that one was finished in the last 5 years, I think. You talk to some curators, and there's like a desire not to do that. You leave, though, sort of Lima, and you get into other museums that some of which have remained the same since the early 20th century, and there's also like there's an affect to it as well, where people are saying, oh, these are the mummies on display. This is how we've always had them. There's also communities that, as I said, are because they perceive some of their mummies as being under threat. I'm thinking in the Central Highlands, from looters, also sometimes from archaeologists and scientists. They take them out of tombs and put them in mummies of their own making in glass cases to protect them, but in conditions that the state then sees and says these are not good conditions.
Well, there's a colonial aspect there too.
Yeah.
because The model for the museum is the Western model.
Yeah, there have been calls, like there's a wonderful essay by Sandra Rodriguez, and I hope it's still up, on Politiama, but she calls for spaces within museums that are places to reconnect and mourn, not necessarily with the remains that are physically there, but to understand that these are not just scientific spaces. And there's the NMAI in DC, Denver Museum of Natural History have spaces of private encounter for visiting tribes and nations with the dead. But what I find powerful about that is that her proposal is that it's a space for anyone, not to interact with the dead that is there, but to sort of like understand that these are spaces that are not just scientific ones, which is something that I think that was there in Teo's the way he talked about his museums, which is sometimes treated as rhetoric. Like he talks a lot about the ashes of our ancestors are in this museum. It's extremely literal. It's not rhetoric. And I think in thinking about museums, there is this either or aspect that we can sometimes fall into, is that they have to be a scientific space, and if they're not a scientific space, then what are they? But realizing that not just descendants, but also the curators have an effective relationship with the people that they're caring for is important. But I think some things are changing, but there is also some people say, this is a North American imposition, this discourse, and it's imperialist in its own way. I hear that a little bit less now, but depends. Thanks for the great question.
Yeah, maybe, just last question, Matt.
I wanted to go back to some of the sort of Peruvian national history here, which is, you've used the words Peruvian remains, Andean remains, but there's a very big difference between the coast and the highlands, or
Right.
at least there's perceived as one. I'm thinking the sort of counterpoint of Teo is Larco, right, and his museum and his collection of Moche objects and their seriation and so on. I was just curious if you could speak a little bit more about that. I also am thinking, of so much of Peruvian archaeology now is dominated not only by North American scholars, but by places like San Marcos and Católica, and their sort of export of expertise or dominance of cultural heritage management. I was just curious if you could sort of connect those threads, or if I'm connecting them erroneously.
No, it's a great question. You can reach back to Theo in his insistence on, you can go back before Theo. Like the word ancient, like the phrase ancient Peruvian, sort of, I see it floated for the first time in the 17th century by a Jesuit to identify the people that were prior to the Incas. And he's doing it in part to say, their descendants are the ones that Spain rules now, not the Incas. And that the Incas were tyrants who we, the Spaniards, are replaced and are now responsible to the actual original members of the land, the Peruvians, ancient Peruvians, which is a stance that the Peruvian state adopts in the 19th century. And it is a collapsing of, if there's the collapsing from the outside of all Andean people are Inca, there is the collapsing that happens in the 19th century of all Andean people are Peruvian, except when they're excluded by the state, which is also a real thing that happens. Theo grabs onto that because of, I think, its argumentative power, that like Andean people are Peruvian people, because of the way that, particularly after the War of the Pacific in the 1870s, they were blamed by Peruvian elites as having betrayed the state, that they weren't good enough fighters, or they allied sometimes with the Chileans. And so Theo's mobilization of that is to say that, Andean people are Peruvian, calling them Indian, and having separate laws for them is an extension of colonial rule. So there's a political content to it, it is quite powerful in the sense that he's trying to make a claim that, this shouldn't be a colonized population. They're citizens. That contrasts, and it's often that's treated as nationalist rhetoric, and it is nationalist in sort of like enshrining a sense of the nation. But I think he's using it to interact with some of the discourses of people like Larco, who are talking about in archaeology or a idea of seriation that sort of is dividing different groups, and saying that you can sort of pull them out and talk about this group on its own and use ceramics too. Theo is interested in having a connected tree, rather than focusing. And this is archaeologists today cannot do what Theo did, which is try and soup to nuts, beginning to end, and not specialize, but although I would say that Theo was both a specialist and a generalist. He was excavating everywhere, but he was constantly developing these, at least orally transmitted theories. Going into the, talking with Parker about this, some of the reactions by North American archaeologists in the 30s and 40s to his work is really revelatory of these changing perspectives of what this was for, because they want to have a seriation that sort of is not so obsessed with showing the links between things, which for Theo was I think a real thing, but also a political one. And there was a feeling that Peruvian archaeology could not, it's in the title, Peruvian archaeology couldn't be defined by one person. And the truth was, it wasn't in that period too. Larco had this really strong relationship with North Americans, that if you want some fascinating reading, Alfred Kroeber's confidential report to Henry Allen Moe, the funder at the Guggenheim, from 1942. There's the public version of Peruvian archaeology in 1942 that was published, but then there's the confidential version, which is in the papers of the American Philosophical Society, in which he goes through every single archaeological actor on the ground in Peru at the time and gives miniature biographies of them, and explains their relationship to each other, dishes some gossip about them. I've been thinking about this there's more to write about there, and there's also things that sort of like it gets so personal at times that shouldn't be sort of like just flatly reproduced. But it helps us. I mean, like even the actors that are the Peruvian archaeologists are not monolithic within their in their ambit. And Teo in particular, you know, I think there can be a narrative like, oh, he was dominating everything. He was also somebody who was incredibly vulnerable to the state, who was kicked out of multiple museums, and that I do believe was, in the case of the Paracas mummies, really trying to, you know, he was unwrapping them, but he was also dealing with sort of like the logistical problem that any museum person knows about, is like you remove, in this case, 429 mummy bundles from the ground. That's the rest of your life. Like, and his decision to allow some of them to be exported in order to get financial support, for example, from the Rockefeller family, that's what let him open his final museum, is this trade-off. And it's, you know, he talks about it very emotionally in interviews and also in accounts of him of that moment and what it meant to finally sort of like when Rockefeller gave him the money to do it. Rockefeller we can understand as part of U.S. cultural imperialism, but what it meant for Teo was that he could stop worrying. Sorry, I can talk about this clearly for a very long time.
No history talk would be complete without geeking out big time on a obscure document located at the American Philosophical Society from 1942 that you have to go read. Before we clap once again and thank both of our speakers, I did just want to mention that it is very fitting that Gabriela's presence here at Brown this week is supported by the Jose Amori Vasquez Fund. Jose Amori Vasquez was a professor of Hispanic Studies here at Brown, who was also the founder of the Center for Latin American Studies in 1972, more or less. And I can't imagine a better kind of coming together of the kind that Pepe would absolutely adore than this conversation, which really showcases the kind of the global reach of Latin American studies as exemplified in Chris's work of seeing that we cannot possibly view Peruvian history and U.S. archaeology as being separated in any way, but also with Gabriela's amazing and fiction, auto fiction, which actually she'll talk about tomorrow morning at the Kogut, which brings her into dialogue and contact with materials from Latin America located in museum collections around the world. So I think we can all inhabit the spirit of Pepe Amor and thank both of our speakers for a really fabulous set of presentations. Thank you.